Hello, everyone, and welcome back to a brand new episode of DSA's Life by Design. Today, I have an absolutely brilliant author joining us on the series, Carl Dellatore. Carl, congratulations, brand new book, and I can't wait to dig into it. We're going to touch on it. It's called Interior Design Masterclass. I think it's a brilliant concept, and we're going to dig into it pretty heavily. And I'd love to also just talk to you about your career. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Arthur. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. First place to start is where I always start with all of our guests, which is the beginning.
All right.
What or who sparked your love for design?
You know, that's a funny thing. I don't remember anything else. Even as a young man, grade school, I was always interested in how things looked and how things were arranged. And I didn't realize it then that I would go on to be a design professional, but it's where I've always been most comfortable. I think while many boys were interested in, baseball and that sort of thing, I just wanted a box of crayons. To be over in the corner with a box of crayons, I was very happy.
Masterclass is one of my favorite concepts, probably of the last decade. So to essentially take that concept, turn it into a book, and get 100 of the best designers around to give you essays and their beliefs and their love behind design is pretty awesome. I just love the concept. I've now said that probably 3 or 4 times, but I think it's a brilliant way to approach something like this. How did it all begin for you, and how did this book essentially come to fruition?
Yes, it's another interesting story. So I owned a textile company. I was represented at Holland and Sherry, and the 2008 recession happened, and suddenly the company went away. Like many people, I was tasked with a reinvention. Years earlier, I had written for House Beautiful when Marion McAvoy was there. I'd written a column that ran for several years, and they ultimately turned that column into a book. So when it came time to reinvent in 2009, 2010, I began thinking about what I'd really like to do, unencumbered by all the stuff that had been in my previous life. What's next? And I had never been to formal design school, but I was 50 at the time, in dire financial straits. So trying to find my way to RISD wasn't going to make very much sense. And I always knew there was a second book in me. The House Beautiful book had done very well. I knew there was a second book. And then it suddenly dawned on me one day, instead of going to a university setting to go to design school, what if I went directly to 100 people who are at the top of their game and asked them to teach me about one subject in the discipline? So scale, proportion, light, color, 100 different ideas. And so I wrote the proposal for that book. And I had a literary agent from my first book with House and Garden, with House Beautiful. And I took the idea to her and she said, no one will ever buy that, Carl. It'll take you 10 years to do the book. So I sat on it for about 6 months. And then I have known Alexa Hampton since she was fairly young. Her father and I were acquainted. And so I called her and I asked her to meet me for a coffee, which we did. I explained the idea to her and she said, there's nobody better to do this, Carl, and you need to meet my literary agent, a man named William Clark. So I met with him. I explained the idea. I wrote the book proposal. And because I owned a textile company that sold fabric to many interior designers, I knew some of them close, I could call. And so people like Charlotte Moss and David Easton and several others, I called and said, I want to do this book and I've got to have 10 people committed to it before we can go to publishers. So I did. I got Alexa and Charlotte Moss and Bunny Williams and Mario Buada and David Easton and many people who bought fabric from me. And so then we took the book out to publishers and several vied for it. I decided ultimately the best fit for me was Rizzoli. And so again, I spent the next 2 years sort of traveling around the country, sitting in people's conference rooms. By and large, I let people tell me what they wanted to teach me about, and then when the subject was already taken, for example, Matthew Smythe wrote about travel. And when I went to Mr. Wolf, he said, I'd like to write about travel. I said, well, someone's already got that. So we worked together to come up with a unique subject. And then people would write. Everyone had 750 words to teach a lesson. So my task was to tell people, it's a really surgical number, 750 words. You've really got to hone in on the answer to what it is that you want us to know when we read your essay. And then, it was many designers are not writers. And because I'm a writer, it was the process of sort of working with people to really refine what they had to say. That's a long answer to a short question, but that's how it happened.
It was a great answer. And I literally am thinking to myself, 100 people, the task that must have been. Were there points where you're just like, I'm never getting this number. This is never getting done. What have I caused in distress for my life?
Yeah, it's actually what happened was I got about 20, perhaps 30 people involved. And then, oddly, public relations agents began to learn of the fact that this book was happening and that Rizzoli had purchased the proposal. And so then my phone began to ring instead of me going to other people. So a designer, PR agent, or someone's assistant, or the designer themselves would reach out to me and say, we understand this book is going on. Would you consider me contributing to it? And so by the time I got to 100, yeah, I had plenty of people to choose from. Yeah, in fact, I'll tell you an interesting piece of it. The last designer to sign on to the book is David Kleinberg. And all throughout the process, I'd reached out to him 2 or 3 times to say, would you consider contributing this book? And he said, I'm not quite certain I have the time. And we went back and forth. And then finally, I had held the subject of taste because, oddly, I think David Kleinberg has some of the best taste in the design industry. So I held that subject and I asked if I could meet him at his office. So I went up to 61st Street and we sat down for coffee. And I said, look, you're number 100. I've been holding this subject for you the whole time, right? I need you to write about it. And he said, okay. And that was that. He was number 100.
You'd mentioned travel earlier, and they say that a good designer has a layered life, often including travel. Do you find this to be true with many of the designers you interviewed? And has travel also played a role in your own work?
I think it's very important for design professionals to travel. As I mentioned, Matthew Smythe wrote about the subject of travel in that book. And when I went to meet with him, he said, very often people think because they've seen pictures of the Champs-Élysées or the Arc de Triomphe or the Eiffel Tower or a boat on the Seine or even the Mona Lisa, that by and large they've been to Paris. But the truth of the matter is the experience of traveling there and then going to each one of those landmark things to see in Paris is really inspirational in a way that the image on a computer screen can't be. He said, and in fact, he said, going to see the Mona Lisa is not necessarily about seeing the picture. It's about standing in front of I.M. Pei's pyramid in front of the Louvre, getting inside, winding your way through the galleries, and then standing in front of it with all these people, many of whom are taking selfies, and then experiencing the canvas. And he said, you haven't seen the Mona Lisa, you've seen that. And I think that idea transcends into design as a rule. I mean, how can you have ionic column involved in a structure that you've created without ever having seen one in person? Of course you could, but you'd be more informed by having seen it in front of your eyes, right? To go into the Pantheon in Rome is to see something that you're not going to see in a picture of the Pantheon online. And for me, I've traveled quite a bit in my life. I'm grateful to say I've had the opportunity to do that. And while I was designing textiles, it might have informed what I was doing. I do it more for leisure these days with my partner. We go on a trip 3 or 4 times a year.
I would imagine that there were so many learnings while you were going through this masterclass experience. What were some of the moments and the learnings that really surprised you?
I often remark about 3. Catherine Scott wrote about the idea of patina. And this, her idea is that unless the marble on the kitchen countertop has gotten scratched and nicked and has evidence of wear, that it's not necessarily beautiful yet. And she talks about ancient structures throughout Europe when you pass through a doorway and the threshold has been worn down over time. That evidence that all those people in history have been through there to wear it down is of great value in design. I was inspired by that. Tom Shearer wrote about the idea of luxury. And when we got into conversation about that, he said, Carl, silk, velvet, Gaggenau appliances, sub-zero refrigerators, none of that is really luxury. What's luxury is if in your mind's eye, you know exactly where you want to be at peace in your life. And he said that for him, it was a cottage high on a bluff overlooking the sea with the windows open and a wood-burning stove and linen. and that informed how he saw luxury and how he offered luxury to his clients. And then I think last, I often talk about Victoria Hagen, who I went to meet with, and she decided to write about this idea of light. And we meandered through conversations about the light in Southampton versus the light in Venice versus the light in New York City, and how it changes and how exciting. And in the end, her conclusion in the essay was to say that light was the only timeless element of design, that everything else changes, but that light is a timeless element. It always has to be there. It also always has to be considered. I had so many of those moments where somebody actually said something revelatory to me, and then we managed to get it down on paper.
Looking at this book, I would imagine for any younger designer, this is a must read, because this is something you go to college for. Imagine literally paying tuition and then getting 100 people to pretty much give you succinct advice in every area you could ever imagine. So younger designers, this is a must read. But for a seasoned designer, how do you see this being a fit, and what can a seasoned designer really take away from reading this book?
So it's sort of interesting, that idea. I've often said it's like having a guest lecture come 100 classes, right? And that's what you get in this book. What I endeavored to do in going to meet with people is not necessarily talk about how high off the dining room table the chandelier should be, because that information is readily available online. It's really the thought process, the philosophy behind the decorative arts that went into this book. And I think that's what makes it a value for seasoned professionals. When I finished, I can't begin to tell you, and I get goosebumps thinking about it. Mario Boato left me a voicemail. He has passed on. It's still on my desktop to say that I had done something absolutely remarkable, that even at his age, which was in the late 70s, perhaps early 80s at that time, he learned something in the book that he would go on to use in a future project. He was already not working, so it was sort of remarkable for him to take a moment to say that to me. And I think, again, it's not about practical application. There's nothing about Photoshop in this book. It doesn't have a plan for an electrical plan for the living room. It has none of those things. It has things that you wouldn't necessarily get until you really met with somebody and talked about their philosophy.
Having your own extensive experience in the industry and then getting to sit down with so many incredible professionals and icons in the industry as well, is there advice that you could essentially put together in bubble wrap for someone just starting out in the industry? Like, here's your starter kit, enjoy.
Well, it's funny. That's another interesting question. There's a young man in my life right now who said he wants to switch gears from the career he's in into design, and asked me what I would do, what I would recommend him to do. And, and kids today, young people today in the design industry have a grasp of digital information in a way I don't necessarily, because I'm in my 60s. But I think the technical prowess with computer skills is really what people ask for most. I have another friend, Daniel, who was looking for a job last year, reached out to me to see if I would ask around to see who was looking to hire somebody. He told me who he really wanted to work for. I contacted several of those people, and the first thing they all said was, do you have SketchUp skills, the rendering skills that people have to have these days? It's not so much just about understanding the difference between linen and polyester or cotton. You have to have those technical skills. I'd start there. And the other thing I would say is you really have to work for somebody else for a period of time. Right. I know that many designers go out on their own and are successful. And Amanda Nisbet, a friend of mine, a friend of hers said, you have such great style. I'd like you to decorate my apartment. And she did, and launched a career. Katie Ritter also had a shop on the Upper East Side. And as the story goes, Brooke Astor's son came in one day and said, you have such interesting style. Would you consider decorating my apartment? And now she has a big business. But I think, what you might get from working 2 to 3 years for somebody who's at the top of their game, as in this book, is really invaluable information.
Was there someone that you interviewed that you expected one thing, but then got another, and were absolutely just blown away by that moment?
Well, I can remark one thing that I was blown away in the book. Early in the process, I went to meet with Bunny Williams, as I've mentioned before, at her offices in New York. to talk about the book. And I said I'd really wanted her advice because she has a book called An Affair with a House that is, by and large, I mean, it's sold maybe 100,000 copies, maybe more, a very successful book. So I wanted to get her view about what I should do in putting this book together. And she asked me who it is that I didn't think belonged in the book. And so I won't say who, but there are some designers who perhaps I don't appreciate the aesthetic. And she stopped me in my tracks after I told her who I didn't necessarily want to include in the book. She said, "You're a journalist, not an arbiter. If someone has a valuable voice, you have to include them in the book. If someone has an audience, if they've been published, you have to include them in the book. You may not want them to decorate your house, but again, you're a journalist, not an arbiter." And I thought that was really interesting. She wrote about the idea of comfort in her essay, which was really great. So many, as I said, so many times during the process of putting this book together, I would be sitting in someone's office and go, "Oh, that never dawned on me. I would have never thought of that." And then I get to pass it along to other people in a book was really sort of the remarkable thing. Again, I went to design school doing this book in a way that no one had ever done before, and that I got to leave it behind for other people is a gift.
I was actually going to ask you that. Going through this process, did it heighten or reawaken your own passion for design?
Well, I've always had a passion for it, as I said. Reawaken, I will say it took me 6 months to recover when I finished, because it was sort of a mad dash to the end. And then I followed it. It had done so well right out of the gate that Rizzoli asked me to do 4 more books. So I jumped right back into the pool with garden design masterclass. Again, 100 gardeners, this time soil, pathways, roses, blue, whatever they wanted to tell me about. So I was right back into the fire. I guess you could, somebody said it's like having 2 children in a row, Irish twins. It's sort of like I went right back into it. But it's certainly, I have a better appreciation for everything I see on a page in a room today than I would have had before doing that book.
Is there a dream project outside of the books?
So in undergraduate school, I studied photography, and I bought a Hasselblad camera, this beautiful German 2.25 camera. And it sat in the closet for, I have to be honest, 35 years. In a nice case, but it was just sat there. And it's an analog camera. It's not a digital camera. And when I turned 60 a few years ago, I said that this is what I would do with the rest of the time I had to be creative in my life. Not only do books, but take this camera out and revisit my interest in photography. And photography is there's so much parallel information about it with design. It's sort of like capturing the frame of something you're looking at is very much a design element, right? I'd love to have a book of all my photographs at some point. And luckily, I know a publishing house that might be interested.
That's awesome.
And we'll see. We'll see.
I want to talk to you about the Designer Society of America, because it's an incredible organization, and they, of course, support interior designers who create their own educational paths to achieve interior design success. So it could be art history, textiles. It's not always conventional, and that's where DSA really strives to help people. What are your thoughts on this and your thoughts around DSA in general?
Well, I think you have a great mission in that, right? So many people come to design. Of course, many people go to the New York School of Interior Design or SCAD or wherever they go to learn the basic skills. But the number of people I know who started in one career and then moved to something else. Charlotte Moss is a great example. She was a stockbroker down on Wall Street, right? But she had a flair, a sense of style. And then she began doing her own homes. And then she decided, no, I don't want to be a stockbroker anymore. And she started to go into design. And she had many friends who ultimately hired her. So it all worked out. But I think whatever avenue you come through to design, what you've done previously is informing what you'll do in the future. So for me, having done these books about design and continuing to do books about design, it will inform the way I see things, as I mentioned, through the camera lens. The same is true for somebody who starts in one career and moves into design. And there are as many ways to become a designer as there are designers, right? I mean, Some people work for somebody for a few years and then go out on their own. Some people go to school and then work for a firm and stay there, and then move to another firm and stay there, and move to another firm to gather more information. I think however you get there, there's so much to be learned, and so much opportunity in the design industry. There, I think Alexa Hampton once said to me, there's work for everyone. And I think there is.
Support is everything. How valuable do you think it is to have an organization like DSA, which can really step in and touch on everything you had just touched on, which is come in and help essentially give a foundation to that transition?
Yeah, I think it's incredibly important. I mean, anyone who starts a business, any entrepreneurial adventure, you've got to have mentors along the road, right? You have to have people who say, maybe this isn't the right decision to be made. Maybe you want to go in a different direction. Years ago, I owned a curtain and upholstery factory. It's a whole nother story. But I had a mentor at the time who came to me through the senior corps of retired executives. And every week he came on a Tuesday and gave me information, much like you do for your designers, right? He gave me information that I might not have ever had as an entrepreneur. And that was invaluable. I suppose in the same way you're invaluable to the designers you work with.
So, Carl, you've obviously had just a prolific career in terms of writing books. I would imagine that there's probably demand for more books or even people working with you. Is that a correct assumption?
Yes, as a matter of fact, it is. I was approached by an architect about 3 years ago to write a book about a building that he was putting up here in New York City on the High Line at 24th and 10th. And so I worked with the team to both write and produce it. And since then, I've worked on 3 other books, up to and including one I'm just finishing now for a designer. He wanted to produce a monograph about his work. But again, as I mentioned earlier, many designers are not necessarily writers. So having read books that I'd produced before, he reached out to say, would you help me produce my book? And I have a literary agent, I'm grateful to say, who's helped to negotiate that. But yeah, it's something that I'm really interested in doing because it furthers my education in the design industry to work with people. And it's also it's subject matter that is so germane to my character that it's not necessarily work. So yes, I'm working with other designers to produce their books now too.
When you get to work with other designers or just other people from any industry, how does that collaboration work? So if a designer reached out to you and they're like, Carl, I want you to help produce my next book, how does that collaboration actually work?
So because I have an agent, what I do is work to identify the theme of the book, whether it be simplicity or color or whatever it is that this particular designer's aesthetic represents. And then we create a proposal. Then I take it to William, my literary agent, and we work together to try to make sure that it's fine-tuned. And then he takes the book out to publishing houses because he has relationships above and beyond Rizzoli. So one book I'm doing now is for Clarkson Potter. Another one I've done for Vendome. So it's not only Rizzoli, I can work with other publishing houses through my literary agent. So yes, people come to me to say, can you help me organize? And there's 2 designers who've asked me to begin working with them, just sort of to say, what do I need to be doing next? And there's lots of advice I give people. Have your work documented. It's so important to have your work photographed. Be sure that it's styled well, because a publishing house wants an image that's captivating. So I can do things like that. Help people find their design voice, what it is that they want to say about themselves in terms of brand message, brand message. And that's been interesting work.
Well, again, congratulations. First of all, the Interior Design Masterclass, brilliant book. It sounds like you are just incredibly busy. And now with being able to help people makes you even busier. Congratulations on all of your success, Carl. And I hope that many interior designers are able to really jump into this and gain the knowledge that you've worked so hard to put together.
Appreciate that. Thank you again, Arthur.
Thanks for joining us on Life by Design.